My name is Olivia Bennett. I'm 29 years old, and this is the story of how the man I called my stepdad tried to take everything my father built, and how the truth came back to him harder than either of us could have imagined. If you like honest, messy life stories, please hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. People assume money makes life simple. They mistake the quiet corners of our house for safety, the way polished surfaces and a private driveway can look like armor. But wealth is just another kind of weather. It can shelter you or it can flood you. I grew up in the sort of house people remark about at parties. White columns, an oak staircase like something out of a magazine, views that dropped off into green like a promise. My father, Garrett Bennett, made that life. He built an empire out of trust, developers, rental complexes, a careful brand of polite ruthlessness that he wrapped in good manners. He was the kind of man who could smile at zoning hearings and make a room feel lighter after the meeting was over. My mother, Evelyn, was elegant the way a particular song can be elegant, always in tune, always managing to make something ordinary feel like a moment. She loved him the way you love a sun you know will never set, quietly, uncritically, in a way that sometimes left her blind. They were together for 25 years before the cancer took him. When he died, the house changed shape, not because we moved, but because his absence made room, and a lot of people were very good at noticing empty spaces. Richard came into our lives like a solution. He was charming in that old Hollywood way, a soft voice and a steady gaze and hands that knew how to hold a cocktail glass without catching the light oddly. He worked in investment management, or so the brochures said. He had gifts for my mother that arrived with small, tasteful notes, a cashmere wrap, a book on impressionist painters, a dinner at a restaurant with a sommelier's name I'd never heard. He moved in 6 months after the funeral. By the time the first year ticked over, he was on the plaques and at the charity galas, shaking hands where my father had once stood. People who buy into stories do it for reasons I understand now. My mother wanted to keep an image, not of herself, necessarily, but of the life she loved and her place in it. I wanted someone who would be kind to her. I wanted the stability everyone said we deserved. My brother Andrew was a different case. At 24, he was still raw from losing his father, and he wanted a man to look up to who told him he was doing okay. At the time, I thought Richard fit in like a new piece in a family puzzle. I could not have known how crooked the edges were. The first sign was small. It was paperwork, innocuous legalese dusted with the comfort of signatures. Garrett had always run things with a certain hands-on manner. Letters in his handwriting, sticky notes, ledger entries that smelled faintly of cigar smoke and old coffee. After he passed, everything got cleaned up, digitized, and organized. Our estate manager, a woman named Claire who'd been with my father since before I was born, handled most of it. She was exacting and soft-spoken, and if anyone could explain how assets could be structured to protect heirs, she could. She was also the person who first mentioned that Richard wanted to make the administration easier for everyone. That phrase, easier for everyone, should have been the yellow flag. Instead, Evelyn and I both nodded. We signed a handful of documents transferring limited authority, one of those moves you make because paperwork is supposed to make grief less messy. We trusted Claire's calm. We were doing the practical things people told us to do. For a while, it was perfect theater. Richard would host dinners where the silver would be polished, and conversations would revolve around foundation work and children's hospitals. He'd laugh at Andrew's jokes in a way that made my brother beam. He'd hand my mother a glass and say, "You did the right thing letting me help," and she would smile and let the phrase settle like a salve. I remember thinking, not even half a year in, that maybe this was how life was supposed to heal, slow and gilded. But trust erodes in small increments. The next sign was a shift in tone at the board of Bennett Holdings, the private company that managed most of my father's assets and investments. Garrett had set up a board that included old friends, lawyers, and a few family allies. It was the architecture that kept one man from deciding everything. Richard petitioned, quietly but persistently, to join the advisory board. He argued that he had experience that could modernize operations, that he'd bring a fresh viewpoint and some contacts in the investment world. The rest of the board hesitated. Richard had the charm to make hesitation sound like a personal slight. Claire told me, over tea in the sunroom one afternoon, that she was worried. She didn't use the word takeover. She used smaller words. Changes in accounting, a movement of funds between a subsidiary labeled development opportunities and an offshore account that, when she probed, smelled wrong. She thought the transfers were irregularly timed, and she said very gently that she wanted to clarify them before answering any of Richard's requests. That was the first time I saw someone, in our orbit, not speak to him the way you speak to a man who is always right. I confronted him the way you confront someone who's become part of your life. In the kitchen, late at night, the house heavy with the quiet of our separate griefs. "Claire's worried," I said. "She's asked for explanations about the accounts." He smiled like the room had a soft light focused on him. "Olivia," he said, "Claire's the moral compass of this household. We could never function without her. I simply think she's being cautious because change can be alarming. I'm trying to protect the family's future." That answer should have been enough. It was. By spring, Richard had consolidated power in ways that were bureaucratic and sly. He pushed through a restructuring plan at dinners over wines, with handouts that made projections look like waterfalls. He proposed a new trust arrangement that would, ostensibly, simplify tax responsibilities and centralize philanthropy. He made diagrams. He used phrases like "for the benefit of the heirs" and "streamlining operations." My mother, exhausted and eager to avoid conflict, nodded and signed. Andrew, flattered to be consulted by a man who treated his opinions like currency, praised his stepdad's vision. I read the documents and felt a sourness like copper on my tongue. There was a clause buried deep in the trust, legal language that redirected voting power to a managing trustee in the event of familial incapacity. The trustee, conveniently, had the same name as someone who had recently been on Richard's board. I tried to raise it with Claire. She was delicate with me, and later I found out she had been more forceful in those closed board meetings than she let on. "Olivia," she said, reaching across the table and taking my hand, "you should know as much as you can, but also know that when people are hurting, they make choices. It's complicated." "What choices?" I asked. "To take everything." She didn't answer the way I wanted. She said nothing. She only looked at me as if I had stepped into a part of my father's life I hadn't been allowed to see. It was then I began to put pieces together. Little discrepancies in charity ledgers, duplicate invoices, a contract that overpaid a consultancy that, when Googled, led to a shell company with an address in the tax haven district. I felt like I was following a trail of breadcrumbs, but the breadcrumbs were often in ink and initials and signatures that Richard's handwriting could imitate. One evening, after a gala at the art museum, I found an email that changed the shape of our household entirely. I shouldn't have been looking, and there are ways to justify the invasion of privacy to yourself when you suspect theft. But when the subject line read "Transfer Confirmation, 2M," and it contained a list of properties flagged as "divest for liquidity," the cursor in my chest started to beat loud and fast. The email thread was long. Names I recognized from Richard's investment network appeared alongside instructions that would move cash from the family trust to a private vehicle with Richard's initials on the account. I didn't react right away. There's a slow-motion quality to the moment when you realize the ground you stand on is not even. You go through stages. First, disbelief. Second, the desperate hope you misread things. Third, a cold, crystalline clarity like glass shattering but with the noises muffled somehow. I confronted him the next day. He was at his desk, near the bay window overlooking Mercer Island, tapping a fountain pen against a legal pad. He looked the same. His hair had the same gray at the temple, his cufflinks caught light. He sat back when I entered. "You seem tense," he said. "Why did you move $2 million out of the family trust?" I asked. My voice wasn't steady. He held my look for a long time. That is what made me nauseous, that he could sit with me and make it seem like this was a small, solvable miscommunication. "Olivia," he said, "I moved funds into a vehicle that will generate returns for the family. Those assets were underperforming. I made a decision, and I'll be happy to explain to the board." "Why does the account have your initials?" I demanded. "Why is the trustee a company you control?" He got to his feet then, slow and deliberate. "You think I'm a thief," he said. He didn't sound angry. He sounded disappointed, as if I had misunderstood his role. I invested. I'm trying to secure the family's legacy. Your father wanted the estate to grow. Sometimes that means acting boldly. My mother, when I told her, cried in a way that was immediate and unknowable. She clung to Richard not like someone defending him, but like someone grasping for the tail of a kite she feared would fly away. Andrew was heartbroken and confused and kept trying to mediate, saying things like, "Maybe there's paperwork to fill, Olivia. Maybe this is a temporary move." I became a person who paid attention to paper. I made friends with accountants and real estate lawyers and a woman named Nora, who turned out to be the best possible weapon in the tedium of financial warfare. Nora had been my friend since kindergarten. We'd gone to the same schools and watched each other fail and succeed in small, brave ways. She was now a senior counsel at a law firm that handled estate litigation. When I told her, she didn't gasp or say, "How terrible." She paused, then asked one precise question. "Do you have copies of the trust documents and all the transfers?" "Yes," I lied. I had screenshots and emails and a folder I'd been tucking into the cloud. But Nora needed the full package, and so she started to pull us apart like a seamstress, determined to see where the stitches had been replaced. "Olivia," she said in a voice that was both kind and clinical, "this is fraud if there's intentional misrepresentation. It's also a breach of fiduciary duty if he's using trust assets for personal gain." She spit the words like a knife, and then said something that made my stomach drop. "We should assume he'll deny everything." He denied everything when confronted. He used the same rhetorical tools that people use in House of Cards situations: plausible language, plausible deniability, the willingness to appear wounded. He told the board that he had been acting as a consultant and that any transfers were temporary, designed to leverage market conditions. He showed them figures that, on the surface, looked promising and arrhythmic enough to distract. He used a consultant's report and a spreadsheet with glossy charts. He had, by then, begun a campaign to position himself as the one person who could keep us solvent, who could maintain the Bennett standard. He leaned into the protector narrative, and it worked on my mother. People gravitate toward narratives that make sense in emotional terms. But financial crime is not built on narratives alone. It's built on records and signatures and the human desire to cover tracks in ink. Nora and I started to gather everything: bank statements, the emails, the contracts that bore bogus consultants' names, the corporate registrations for shell companies. We hired a forensic accountant, a woman named Priya, who smelled faintly of jasmine and had the kind of eyes that make you want to tell the truth. Priya sat with spreadsheets until her eyes went pale. She found a trail of transfers that matched Richard's private spending and a series of loans that, when matched to receipts, had been spent on items with no venal benefit to the trust. An art collection listed at suspiciously inflated values, renovations on a property that had no connection to trust operations, payments to accounts controlled by someone who had the same middle name as Richard's business partner. Each finding was a small flare in the dark. Each one made it harder for the board to explain away his decisions. I'd like to say that the turning point was dramatic, the sort of scene where a gavel drops and a man's face turns ashen. That isn't how it happened. The turning point was a series of quiet, humiliating defeats for Richard. A request denied by a bank when a signature didn't match. A consultant who turned out to be fictitious when we called a number and nobody answered. Andrew refusing to co-sign a document to finalize a transfer and instead demanding an independent audit. It was, to Richard's frustration, a months-long erosion. He had created a network of small, legalistic conveniences that added up to theft. And the network required our silence and inattention to survive. When he realized we were not silent, he doubled down. That was when the other side of his character, the one with the public smile and private ferocity, became reality. He threatened Claire. He hinted at legal battles that would drag up things that would embarrass us. He suggested that if he were pushed, his other contacts, the ones with money and reputation, would side with him. He tried to make fear the currency in the room. We did not cave. Instead, we started to document the threats, keep recordings of calls where he suggested that his influence could sway decisions, and prepare for a civil suit that would have the potential to grow into a criminal case. Nora, Priya, and I were like three people learning to swim in winter water. Every plunge took the air out of us, but we surfaced with something new. The lawyers filed notice of a fiduciary breach and requested an emergency freeze on the accounts. He responded in the way abusive people often do when the world constricts around them, with performative repentance in public and with coercion in private. He staged a meeting where he apologized for any misunderstandings and promised to relinquish certain duties while we clarified matters. My mother cried and hugged him, and for a moment, I felt the gnawing of betrayal stretch into something larger. What had been stolen was not only money, but a division of identity at the heart of our home. My brother wavered. There was a night he slept on the porch because the thought of choosing sides left him dizzy. The court proceedings were as dry as they were public. Legal filings are a kind of storytelling that requires exactness and patience. The filings enumerated irregularities with dates and amounts and attached copies of contracts and emails. Priya's forensic analysis interpolated the transfers and showed that funds labeled for development ended up in a vehicle that paid Richard's personal cards and a series of ventures with no verifiable business operations. Richard's response was theatrically wounded. He accused us of betraying family, of weaponizing grief, of attempting to humiliate him publicly. He gave a speech at a gala in which he talked about honor and service, and he looked the way a trained actor looks when reciting lines written to elicit sympathy. Some people still clung to him. Money, as I said, buys small tribes. What the lawsuit did that nothing else had been able to do was make the story a matter of public record. Articles appeared in local papers, careful, factual pieces about a dispute within a prominent family. Friends called, and some said sorry, and some did not pick up. The headline was not sensationalist. It was precise. Bennett Holdings freezes alleged after fiduciary breach claims. The publicity was a blade that cut in different ways. For Richard, it meant reputation damage. For my mother, it meant an exposure she'd rather not have had. For the family, it became a crucible. The most satisfying moment for me, and I say satisfying because justice can feel that way, though it's never devoid of cost, was when a small, seemingly insignificant piece of paperwork unraveled the rest. It was a ledger entry that mentioned an art appraisal company. We had already been suspicious of that art. The appraisal came back and it was fraudulent. The signature of the appraiser was forged, the valuation inflated. The appraiser's phone number, when traced, led to a short-term rental address. The company registration was a single pay stub, and the names on the registration matched an address associated with one of Richard's shell companies. When we presented that in court, the way the judge looked at Richard had a softness in it that was almost pity. The legal apparatus is designed to find connections and hold people accountable when enough threads are tied together. It wasn't dramatic violence, but it was thorough. The judge issued a preliminary injunction removing Richard's position as managing trustee pending further investigation and ordered forensic audits and criminal referrals if fraud was confirmed. In the months that followed, the state's prosecutor opened an inquiry. He was charming before the cameras, and then in less than a year he was in depositions where he could no longer hide behind charm. There were settlements and plea discussions in hushed rooms. Some of his allies distanced themselves. A few came forward and testified about their own unease, the sort of moral courage that is quieter than it looks. Richard ultimately pleaded guilty to several counts related to embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty. He was sentenced to a term that left him with few options: restitution, public apologies, and a period of court-mandated oversight on his financial activities. It was not the scandalous downfall you see in movies, where a man is dragged publicly into the muck. It was paperwork and hearings, and the slow dismantling of an empire that had been secretly the size of his ambitions. But it was justice, and for me that meant a kind of reclamation. There were consequences I hadn't bargained for. My mother spent months in a fog of shame and grief. She retreated from public life and refused interviews. Some friends we had relied on shifted away, their allegiances rearranged by gossip. Andrew, who had been so tethered to his need for paternal approval, had to rebuild a relationship with his own truth. He apologized to me one night at midnight, sitting on the back steps while the lights of the city blinked distant and human. "I wanted to believe in someone so badly," he said. "I didn't want to see it because I thought seeing it would make me lose more than I could bear." You didn't lose anything you couldn't find again, I told him, though I should have kept my mouth shut because that felt like a platitude. It was still true in the way small truths are true. You can rebuild slowly, and the foundation you rebuild upon can be steadier because you know what it means to look closely. Economically, the estate recovered. We restructured the trust under independent oversight and built a board with professionals who were specifically disavowed of any relationship to the family beyond their expertise. We tightened processes, put in checks, and hired a permanent forensic advisor as part of our governance. It's bureaucratic, but those details matter. Justice, in financial matters, is not enough without systems that make the same mistake harder to repeat. The emotional repair was the hard part. My mother and I had to learn each other again. At 72, she was a woman who felt diminished by her own choices and needed the quiet reassurance of being seen. We spent a winter going through albums, telling stories about my father, about the way he made coffee or the way he would hum when he painted. We talked about Richard less and about my father and what he had done well more. My relationship with Andrew was not magically restored. It took time, candid conversations, and therapy where we learned how to be two adults who had both been children in different kinds of storms. People ask me now, sometimes strangers, sometimes people who have watched me speak at a charity luncheon or read an article about the case, whether I feel vindicated. Vindication is an odd word because it suggests triumph. I don't feel triumphant. I feel relieved in a way that hums through my bones. I feel like someone who was given back a room in her own house. I also feel that justice, while necessary, leaves places that need tending. There are days when I remember Richard's smile and feel an ache that is not merely about money. People are complex. Predators can be personable. The lesson of it was not, for me, that people are simple villains, but that systems matter and that love, cautioned by prudence, is less likely to be used as a lever. The courtroom sequences, the legal filings, and the careful, quiet unraveling of the scheme made for a sort of public definitiveness. But the private moments, the afternoons with Claire sorting binders, the late-night calls with Nora, the way my mother would sometimes fall asleep while we talked, were the ones that taught me what it means to be human in the aftermath of betrayal. When Richard went to sentencing, he avoided my gaze. He had, in the months since the filings, tried to contact me directly with apologies that were more performances than contrition. He sent a bouquet to my mother and a letter to the family saying he was sorry for any pain he caused, and that he meant well. I mailed the bouquet back. I didn't reply to the letter. On the day of his sentencing, the courtroom felt ordinary. He stood, a man in a suit that suddenly looked slightly too small, and read his prepared statement. His voice had the pitch of someone still accustomed to being believed. The judge, old and exact, listened. The sentence was what we expected. Restitution, community service, a period of supervised oversight, and a term of incarceration conditioned on the success of his restitution plan. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about accountability. After the court formalities ended, I remember walking through a courtyard outside the courthouse with Andrew. It was late spring. The city had that particular scent that comes when plants have finally decided to turn fully green. Andrew took my hand, and we didn't say anything for a long while. We allowed the silence to be a thing between us that felt like recovery, not theatrical, not over-sentimentalized. "Do you hate him?" he asked finally. "No," I said, "but I don't feel anything like I did when I thought he was family. I feel steady. I feel like we can do the work of keeping each other safe." He stayed out of the limelight. The charitable foundation my father had started continued, but under more stringent governance. We rededicated efforts to community housing initiatives that had been my father's passion. The idea, he always said, wasn't profit alone, but the responsibility to create lasting places for families. The irony was not lost on me that a man who had profited from properties had attempted to leverage them for his own greed. The foundation, now, felt like an act of repair. Months became years. I learned to run our small piece of the family business with more thoroughness and less romance. I learned to ask more questions and to appreciate professionals who were not seduced by charm. I met people who were decent in the way that is steady. Accountants who liked spreadsheets more than applause, a board chair who wore sensible shoes and had a stubborn fondness for process. I started dadding again, hesitantly. and discovered that the best intimacy is based in candor and the tiny willingness to reveal the things you fear you might lose. What I tell people now is not just a story of betrayal and justice. It is a story about the ways we are entrusted to guard one another, not because we love wealth, but because we love what a life affords: safety, choice, the ability to help others. My father's legacy was complicated, generous and exacting, flawed and brilliant, and after what happened, I felt not like an heir to a fortune, but as a steward of a set of responsibilities. If there's a moral to this that isn't trite, it's this: proximity to wealth is not protection from harm. Sometimes it invites it. But structure and vigilance can transform vulnerability into resilience. You can love someone fiercely and still ask questions. You can put systems into place not because you don't trust people, but because you choose to protect the ones you love. Sometimes people ask whether I regret the lawsuits, whether the public exposure was worth the private pain. The answer is complicated. There were nights I thought of leaving everything behind and living with a small apartment and a simpler name. There were nights when my mother would wake up in tears. But standing back now, I see that the lawsuit was less about punishment and more about restoring truth. We made the choice to illuminate what had been hidden, and while it cost us in dignity and peace for a time, it returned to us a sense of agency. I don't have scenes of cinematic revenge to offer. There's no moment where Richard's face crumbles on camera and confessions spill like rain. What I do have is paperwork stamped with judgment, an executed restitution plan, and the voice in my head that knows we acted when it mattered. I have mornings when I wake up and the house feels like a place I belong in for reasons beyond memory or picture frames. I have a family that communicates more honestly, even when the truth is uncomfortable. And most of all, I have learned that justice is not always quick, but it is possible when people are willing to do the tedious work of following paper trails, asking hard questions, and refusing to let charm become an excuse. There are quieter, kinder victories, too. Claire retired with a small ceremony that was awkward and lovely. She said it was because she wanted to travel, but I know she left because she had done the work she could and wanted the world to be less contingent upon a single person's character. Andrew found a job in the firm, a junior position, and he's good at the math and patient with the meetings. My mother has begun to teach a class once a month on floral arrangements at a community center. She says it calms her, and she likes tending things that won't be sold. If you ever find yourself in a situation where a person you trust asks you to sign something and your gut whispers no, listen. Ask for counsel. Insist on independent oversight. Love is not diminished by asking for transparency. It is protected. When I tell this story, I sound calm because time has smoothed the edges. But underneath the calmness is a hard-won clarity. Betrayal is a fracture. Justice is the rebuilding that follows. It isn't always perfect. It isn't always as dramatic as a movie. It is, more often than not, a long sequence of small, deliberate acts that add up until the weight of truth becomes undeniable. In the end, my stepfather lost more than money. He lost the casual reverence with which he could walk into rooms and be believed. He lost the quiet influence that had allowed little lies to pucker into big ones. He lost the posture of a family man. Justice sometimes looks like a reduction to essentials: accountability, restitution, and the removal of opportunity. It's not revenge. It's the state enforcing the rules we pretend are obvious. For me, the most important thing was what remained: a mother who could be honest with herself and with me, a brother who learned to see clearly, and a home that, finally, felt like it belonged to us again. We rebuilt not because we had to, but because we chose to. We made structures so the same mistake would be harder to repeat. We learned to protect one another from charm and to value the quiet people who notice details. If this story matters to you in any small way, then maybe it will matter to someone else who worries they've been blinded by a familiar face. Money complicates love, and love can complicate judgment. But when you combine vigilance with compassion, you create a kind of armor that isn't cold. It's just practical. Family should be about care, not control, and I finally learned that the hard way.